A president has just been assassinated. Church bells begin ringing across America. Families stop what they are doing. Factories fall silent. Newspapers print a single shocking headline: Abraham Lincoln is dead. But somewhere in the country, one poet chooses not to write about the assassin, or the politics, or even Lincoln himself. Instead, he writes about a blooming lilac, a lonely bird singing in the woods, and a single evening star disappearing into the western sky. Why? Why would one of America's greatest poets write one of history's greatest elegies without ever mentioning Abraham Lincoln's name? The answer lies inside a poem that transformed personal grief into something every generation could understand. This is the story of When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom'd, and the tragedy that inspired it. When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom'd, the poem that helped America grieve, America thinks the war is over. April 1865. After 4 long years of civil war, America can finally breathe again. More than 600,000 people have died. Families have been torn apart. Entire towns have disappeared. Yet hope is beginning to return. General Robert E. Lee has surrendered. The Confederacy is collapsing. People gather in the streets. Bands play patriotic songs. Churches hold Thanksgiving services. For the first time in years, the future looks brighter. And standing at the center of that hope is one man, Abraham Lincoln. He isn't simply the president anymore. To millions of Americans, he has become the symbol of survival itself. Few realize they have less than a week left with him. One night that changed America. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attends a comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington. He looks exhausted. The weight of the war still rests on his shoulders. But for one evening, he allows himself to relax. The audience laughs. Actors perform. Everything seems ordinary. Then a gunshot. Panic erupts. The president slumps forward. Within moments, the celebration of victory becomes a national nightmare. Lincoln dies the following morning. He is only 56 years old. News spreads faster than anyone imagined possible. Telegraph wires carry the message from city to city. By sunset, America knows its greatest victory has become its greatest sorrow. A nation falls silent. Imagine waking that morning. The war is almost over. The country is finally healing. Then someone tells you, the president has been murdered. Witnesses describe entire streets falling silent. Businesses close. School lessons stop. Church bells ring without interruption. People who had never met Lincoln begin weeping openly. Some historians compare the shock to the assassination of John F. Kennedy nearly a century later. Others argue it was even greater, because Lincoln wasn't just a political leader. For many Americans, he represented the possibility that the nation itself might survive. Now, that hope seemed uncertain once again. A poet watching from the crowd, where was Walt Whitman? Not inside Ford's Theater, not standing beside Lincoln, not even in the same room. But he was nearby, living in Washington, D.C. Whitman had spent much of the Civil War volunteering in military hospitals. Day after day, he visited wounded soldiers. He brought fruit, books, writing paper. Sometimes, he simply sat beside young men who knew they would never return home. Those years changed him forever. He saw courage. He saw suffering. He saw death become an almost ordinary part of daily life. And throughout those years, one figure quietly inspired him: Abraham Lincoln. The two men were never close friends. In fact, they barely knew each other. Whitman often watched Lincoln from a distance as the president rode through Washington in a carriage. He admired his humility, his sadness, his determination. Years later, Whitman would remember seeing Lincoln's face and thinking, here is the man carrying the weight of an entire nation. When Lincoln died, Whitman didn't lose a friend. He lost a symbol. And symbols are often harder to replace than people. The funeral that united America a few days later, Lincoln begins one final journey. Not toward Washington, away from it. His funeral train travels nearly 1,700 miles, retracing much of the route he had taken to his first inauguration in 1861. Over almost 2 weeks, the train passes through 7 states and stops in major cities including Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, and finally Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln will be buried. Millions of people gather along the tracks. Some wait for hours, just to catch a glimpse of the passing train. Children hold flowers. Old soldiers remove their hats. Entire towns stand in complete silence. For many, this is their only chance to say goodbye. It becomes one of the largest public mourning events in American history. And somewhere along that long journey, Walt Whitman begins asking himself a question. How do you write about grief so immense that it belongs to an entire nation? Not just one family, not just one city, an entire country. He could have written about Lincoln's speeches, his politics, his achievements. Instead, he chose something entirely unexpected: a flower, a bird, and a star. Why? Because Whitman wasn't trying to write a biography. That's why Walt Whitman never named Abraham Lincoln. In the poem, he was trying to give sorrow a language. This is the saddest poem America ever wrote, and in doing so, he would create one of the greatest elegies ever written. But before we can understand the poem, we have to understand the man who wrote it. A different kind of war hero. When people think about the American Civil War, they usually picture generals, battlefields, cannons, flags. Walt Whitman saw something very different. Hospital beds, bandages, amputations, and thousands of frightened young men. Far from home, he wasn't a soldier. He never carried a rifle. Yet for years, he spent his days walking from hospital to hospital, sometimes bringing oranges, sometimes books, sometimes simply holding the hand of someone who had no family left. Whitman later wrote that the real history of the Civil War wasn't found in government reports. It was written on the faces of ordinary people. That experience changed his poetry forever. He stopped writing about heroes. He started writing about humanity. The president he never knew hears something surprising. Whitman and Lincoln were never friends. They never sat together, never exchanged letters, never had long conversations. In fact, it's possible Lincoln never even read Whitman's poetry. So why did Lincoln's death affect Whitman so deeply? Because Whitman believed Lincoln represented something larger than politics. Whenever the president rode through Washington in his carriage, Whitman sometimes stood quietly among the crowd, watching, observing. He later described Lincoln as someone who carried enormous sadness, yet never stopped moving forward. To Whitman, Lincoln became the face of a wounded nation. And then, that face disappeared. A country searching for words. Grief is strange. The larger it becomes, the harder it is to describe. How do you write about millions of broken hearts? How do you describe silence stretching across an entire country? Whitman tried again and again. Nothing felt big enough then. Spring arrived. Lilacs bloomed outside people's homes. Birdsong returned to the forests. Evening stars appeared exactly as they always had. Nature continued, as if nothing had happened. That contradiction fascinated him. How could the world remain so beautiful while so many people were suffering? The answer would become his poem, the flower that started everything. Imagine walking outside. The air smells of spring. A purple lilac blooms beside a simple doorway. Most people would admire it and keep walking. Whitman stopped, because flowers don't understand history. They bloom whether presidents live or die. Every spring, the lilac returns, year after year. It quietly remembers, without speaking, without judging, without forgetting. Whitman suddenly realized, memory works the same way. Long after people disappear, something inside us continues to bloom. The lilac wasn't just a flower anymore. It became remembrance itself. But it wasn't enough. One symbol couldn't carry an entire nation's grief. He needed something else, something that could sing when people no longer could. A song hidden in the forest. One evening, Whitman heard a bird, not in the city, not near crowds, deep inside quiet woods. It was the hermit thrush. Most Americans had probably never seen one. Small, brown, unremarkable. Yet its song stopped Whitman in his tracks. Naturalists still describe the hermit thrush as one of North America's most haunting singers. Its voice echoes through forests with remarkable clarity. Whitman listened and heard something unexpected. Not happiness, not celebration, acceptance. The bird didn't deny death. It simply sang through it. For Whitman, that became one of the poem's greatest discoveries. Perhaps grief isn't something we overcome. Perhaps it's something we learn to carry. But one mystery remained: the flower had become memory. The bird had become acceptance. Yet every night, Whitman kept looking west, toward a single bright star. Why did that star haunt him? Why does it appear again and again throughout the poem? And why, after writing nearly 200 lines, does Whitman still refuse to say the name? Abraham Lincoln. The answer transforms the poem from a historical tribute into something timeless. The star that wouldn't leave for weeks after Lincoln's death. One image refused to leave Whitman's mind. Not the funeral train, not the crowds, not the speeches. A single star, low in the western sky. Night after night, he found himself looking toward it. At first, it seems like an odd detail. Why would a star matter after such a national tragedy? Then Whitman quietly gives us the answer. Just as Lincoln disappeared from the nation, the evening star disappeared beneath the horizon. Its absence became a reminder that even the brightest lights eventually leave us. The star wasn't simply describing the night sky. It became the first symbol of loss. A light that had guided millions was suddenly gone. And yet, Whitman never writes, "This star is Abraham Lincoln." He trusts the reader to make the connection. That decision changes everything. Because now the poem isn't trapped in one historical moment. The star can become anyone we've ever lost: a parent, a child, a friend, a teacher, anyone whose absence changed the way we see the world. Why doesn't he say Lincoln? This is perhaps the greatest mystery in the entire poem. Lincoln's assassination inspired every page, yet his name appears nowhere. That wasn't an accident. Whitman wrote several poems directly about Lincoln. In those poems, he names him openly. So why not here? Because this poem wasn't meant to be a newspaper report. It was meant to become something larger. Whitman understood that names anchor a poem to one person. Symbols allow it to belong to everyone. If he had written, "I mourn Abraham Lincoln," future readers might admire the poem, but they might never see themselves in it. Instead, he writes about grief itself. And suddenly, the poem becomes timeless. Every generation finds its own Lincoln. Every reader remembers someone different. That's the extraordinary power of symbolism. It doesn't tell you what to feel. It invites you to bring your own memories into the poem. 3 voices of grief by now. 3 images have emerged: the lilac, the western star, the hermit thrush. At first they seem unrelated: a flower, a bird, a distant light. But together, they tell the emotional journey of grief. The star reminds us of what we've lost. The lilac keeps memory alive. The bird teaches us that sorrow doesn't have to end in silence. Notice something remarkable. Whitman never argues these ideas. He never says, "This is the lesson." He lets nature speak for him. That's one reason the poem still feels fresh, more than 150 years later. It doesn't lecture. It invites. A walk through the forest. Imagine Whitman walking alone at dusk. The war is over. Lincoln is gone. The country is exhausted. He steps away from the noise of cities, away from funeral processions, away from politics, into the woods. There, he hears the hermit thrush singing. Not triumphantly, not sadly, simply, honestly. The bird doesn't pretend death isn't real. It doesn't try to erase pain. It sings alongside it. Whitman realizes something profound. Healing doesn't begin when grief disappears. Healing begins when we stop running from it. That insight transforms the entire poem. It's no longer about death. It's about learning how to live after death. More than an elegy, most elegies ask us to remember the dead. Whitman's poem asks something different. How do we continue living without forgetting? Can memory and hope exist together? Can beauty still matter after tragedy? The answer unfolds quietly. Not through arguments, not through politics, but through spring itself. The flowers return. The birds sing again. The stars rise each night. Nature doesn't erase grief. It carries it forward. Whitman suggests that perhaps people can do the same. The moment everything changes by this point. The poem is no longer about Abraham Lincoln. It has become about every person who has stood beside a grave, wondering how life could possibly continue. That's why readers around the world still return to it. Not because they all know American history, but because they all know loss. And just when the poem seems to have found peace, Whitman makes one final discovery. The greatest tribute to the dead isn't remembering how they died. It's remembering how they lived. That realization changes not only the ending of the poem, but the way generations of readers have understood grief itself. And it's why this poem remains one of the greatest elegies ever written. Most poems belong to the time in which they are written. This one escaped it. More than 160 years have passed since Walt Whitman first published When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom'd. Empires have risen and fallen. Wars have come and gone. Generations have disappeared. Yet every spring, someone discovers this poem for the first time. Why? Because grief has never gone out of date. Every generation loses someone. Every family knows absence. Every heart eventually asks the same question Whitman asked in 1865. How do we keep living after loss? Whitman never offers an easy answer. Instead, he offers companionship. He reminds us that grief isn't a problem to solve. It's a journey to survive. The wisdom hidden in nature. Look again at Whitman's three symbols: the evening star, the lilac, the hermit thrush. At first they seem ordinary: a flower, a bird, a point of light in the sky. But together, they become a map of morning. The star teaches us that every life, no matter how bright, eventually fades from our sight. The lilac reminds us that memory returns, just as spring returns, carrying love forward instead of letting it disappear. And the hermit thrush, perhaps the quietest symbol of all, teaches us that sorrow doesn't silence life. It becomes part of its music. Whitman doesn't tell us to forget. He doesn't tell us to move on. He invites us to remember, without being destroyed by remembrance. That may be the poem's greatest gift. Lincoln becomes every person we have loved. There's another reason Whitman never names Abraham Lincoln. If he had, the poem would forever belong to one man. By leaving Lincoln unnamed, Whitman creates space for every reader. Today, someone grieving a parent may see their own story in the Western Star. Another reader may think of a child, a friend, a partner, a teacher. The poem changes because we change. Its symbols quietly absorb our own memories. That's why readers return to it again and again throughout their lives. The poem grows older, but somehow it keeps speaking to each new generation. Very few works of literature achieve that. More than an elegy, Whitman called America a democracy. But he believed democracy was more than elections or governments. It was shared humanity. The Civil War tested that belief more than anything else. The nation had torn itself apart. Families fought families. Neighbors fought neighbors. Trust seemed impossible to rebuild. Then Lincoln died. Many feared the country's future had died with him. Whitman answered that fear, not with politics, but with poetry. He suggested that healing begins the moment we recognize our shared grief. Long before we agree with each other, we mourn beside each other. And perhaps that is where a nation begins again. Imagine Whitman years later, walking quietly through the same spring countryside. The lilacs bloom again. Birdsong echoes through the trees. The evening star appears just above the horizon. Nature hasn't forgotten Lincoln. It simply remembers him differently. Not with monuments, not with speeches, but with the quiet rhythm of returning seasons. Whitman realizes something beautiful. Death may interrupt a life, but it cannot erase love. Love survives in memory, in stories, in songs, in poems. Every spring, the lilacs bloom again, not because they deny sorrow, but because they prove sorrow is never the end of the story. Perhaps that's why When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom'd still feels so powerful today. It doesn't ask us to stop grieving. It doesn't promise that pain will disappear. Instead, it offers a quieter hope. that beauty can exist beside sorrow, that memory can exist beside healing, and that even after the darkest nights, the stars return, the birds sing, the flowers bloom. Whitman wrote this poem after America lost its president. But in doing so, he gave the world something far greater. He gave us a language for loss. And perhaps that's what great literature has always done. Not simply tell us stories, but help us survive the moments when words alone are no longer enough. If this poem moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which symbol spoke to you the most? The lilac, the hermit thrush, or the evening star? Share your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering the stories, history, and hidden meanings behind the world's greatest works of literature, subscribe and join us. Because every classic has a story that deserves to be felt, not just read. Until next time, thank you for watching.